The Last Light of Valachan. By David Hall. Friday, the 11th of April, 2025, 12:22. Chapter I, The Wake of the Mists. Word count, Chapter I 1417. Total word count, 1417. The first thing Gideon heard was the breath of the jungle. A long, humid exhalation, thick with rot and heat and the distant, rhythmic chee of unseen predators. The trees around him were gnarled and unnatural, their trunks like sinew and bone, their leaves dripping like flayed skin. The earth beneath him pulsed, wet and soft, as if it too had a heartbeat. He pushed himself to his feet, armor creaking, silvered plate marred by black soil and dark crimson, his blood or someone else's, he couldn't say. His sword, Judgment, was still at his side, its faint golden glow flickering like a dying candle. He was not in coma anymore. The mists had taken him again. Where? He rasped. His throat was dry. Where am I? No answer. Only the jungle breathing. Watching. Waiting. He stumbled forward, past thorn-thick vines and roots like twisted fingers, until he reached a small rise in the terrain. The trees parted slightly, offering a narrow view of the world beyond. A black sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over an endless stretch of emerald canopy. From above, it might seem beautiful. But Gideon knew better. He was in Valachan. He had heard tales whispered by broken souls in the darker corners of Barovia and Cartacas, tales of a land where the wild devoured the righteous, where the laws of men and gods held no weight. Where the weak were hunted, and the strong became monsters. He grimaced. His tabard, once white with the golden emblem of his order, was slashed and soaked with filth. His holy symbol, a sunburst fashioned of gold and crystal, was cracked. He held it in a gauntleted hand and whispered a prayer to Lathander. Nothing answered. Not even silence. Only laughter. It was faint. Far off. A cruel giggle, broken by rustling leaves and the cracking of branches. Then a scream, a roar, desperate cry, human and terrified, cut short by a wet, tearing sound. Gideon's jaw tightened. He drew Judgment. The blade hissed as it left the scabbard, its golden light stuttering before holding fast. A tiny sun in the gloom. He made his way toward the sound. The body was torn nearly in half. A man, young, maybe 20, his chest ripped open, ribs cracked like splintered wood. Vines slithered over his corpse, already reclaiming it. His face was frozen in a mask of horror, eyes wide and staring into oblivion. Animal tracks surrounded the corpse, but they were wrong. Too large. Too many claws. But the worst thing was the brand on his chest. Burned into his skin above the heart. A bloody claw. The mark of the chosen. Gideon had heard of it. In Valachan, some were taken by the mists and branded by its dark lord, Chacuna. Marked to be hunted. They called it the trial. A game. The worst kind, where the prey bled, and the predator smiled. The paladin knelt and whispered a prayer for the dead. The light on his blade flickered with his words, but the jungle sneered. A low growl echoed through the canopy, close. He stood. They were watching him. 3 of them. Half men, half beasts. Their eyes were yellow and cruel, and their bodies lean with muscle and fur. Clawed hands gripped curved knives and jagged spears. They wore trophies, ears, fingers, scraps of bone and sinew. One of them licked his lips, bearing blood-stained fangs. They surrounded him with practiced ease. Predators. Gideon didn't flinch. You have no mark, one of them hissed, voice thick with amusement. Not prey. Not yet. Then walk away, Gideon said. The beast thing cocked its head. No. We eat you anyway. They moved in. The first one lunged. Gideon moved faster. His blade sang, the light flaring as it cleaved through the beast's arm. Blood sprayed, hot and black, and the thing howled, stumbling back with its stump gushing. Gideon didn't stop. He pivoted, shield raised, catching a spear and twisting it from the attacker's grasp before driving judgment through its throat. The last one slashed across his back, steel scraped plate, denting but not breaking. He spun, elbow crashing into its jaw, then brought his sword down in an arc that split its head in two. The jungle was still again. Only 3 bodies at his feet, steaming. Gideon exhaled, blood dripping from his armor. He turned back to the branded corpse. You were never meant to survive here, he murmured. Neither was he. But he would. Even if the gods had abandoned him. Even if the jungle claimed his soul. Chapter 2, The Scarlet Trail. Word count, Chapter 2 2034. Total word count, 3,451. The corpse was gone. Gideon had barely moved 100 paces from the clearing, following a faint game trail, when he turned back to get his bearings, and found nothing. No body. No blood. Not even the bent leaves or broken branches where he'd fought. As if the jungle had swallowed it whole. It wants me lost, he thought. It wants me alone. He pressed forward. The trail was barely more than a suggestion, but it twisted through the trees with the shape of something alive, like a serpent winding through prey. The roots pulled at his boots, and gnarled branches snagged on his armor. Sweat soaked his skin beneath the plate, his breath heavy in the humid air. Then he saw it. A clawed mark on a tree, fresh, gouged deep, as though by talons. And beside it, a smear of blood. Not old. Still wet. Gideon knelt and touched the bark. The blood was thick and warm. Someone was alive. And wounded. He followed. It took hours. Or minutes. Or days. Time didn't behave the same in the mists, especially not in Ravenloft. The sun never truly rose nor set, just hovered, bloated and low, like a predator pacing outside the veil of perception. But the blood trail was steady. Smeared on bark. Splattered on leaves. Once, he found a torn scrap of cloth, part of a tunic, clutched in the jaws of a thorned bush. There were drag marks, too. As if someone had fallen and been pulled along by another. More than one survivor. He pressed forward. The sounds of the jungle dulled around him. Birds stopped calling. Insects ceased their whine. Even the rustling of leaves above grew still, replaced by something else, panting. Wet, desperate. Human. He rounded a bend in the trail, and there she was. A girl. Maybe 17. Dirt and blood caked her skin. Her tunic was torn, her arms covered in shallow cuts, her left foot twisted at a wrong angle. She leaned against a thick tree, clutching a crude wooden dagger. Next to her, another form. A boy, slumped face down. No visible wounds, but still. Too still. The girl saw Gideon and bared her teeth like an animal. Back, she snarled. I'll kill you. He stopped, hands up. I'm not here to hurt you. You're lying, she hissed. You all lie. You come out of the mists and lie and hunt and feed. I saw what you did to Anton. Gideon looked at the boy's body. Pale. Lips blue. No blood, but... He stepped closer. Stop, she screamed. He ignored her. Knelt beside the boy. Turned him gently. A pair of puncture wounds, small and neat, on the side of the neck. Vampiric. But not fresh. He placed a hand on the boy's chest. No heartbeat. Dead. I'm sorry, Gideon said. The girl's knife trembled in her hands. You don't get to say that. He was my brother. I'm not the one who killed him. Then what are you? Her eyes were wild. Starving. Are you a hunter? I'm a paladin. Or I was. You've got no mark. You're not prey. No. Not yet. She said nothing. Just stared. Then. Take me with you. He blinked. What? You heard me. Her voice was hoarse. I'm marked. I've got the claw. Chakuna sent me here a week ago. I'm still alive. I don't care if you're a monster. I'll take my chances. She pulled her tunic aside, and there it was, branded into her skin. The claw. Blackened, blistered. Gideon hesitated. Then nodded. Can you walk? She gave him a long look. No. But I can fight. He carried her. She weighed almost nothing. Starvation had already started to take her, her ribs jutted through skin, and her limbs shook with weakness. She told him her name was Myra, and that she and her brother had been taken during the spring solstice in Kartakas. The mists came into the village, she whispered, half conscious. Rolled in like fog. Next thing I knew we were here. In the dark. Marked. And she trailed off. Chakuna? Gideon asked. Myra didn't answer. She had passed out. They found shelter that night in the hollow trunk of a collapsed jungle giant. Gideon laid Myra down gently, wrapped her in his cloak, and fed her a strip of dried meat from his pouch. She chewed like an animal, no trust, only desperation. He built no fire. Light drew attention. Instead, he placed judgment before the entrance to the hollow, its glow dim but steady. A ward. A warning. He tried to pray. To Lathander. To Helm. Even to Tyr, whose justice had once burned in his bones like a second heart. No answer. Only the jungle. Breathing. The dream came. Blood-soaked leaves. Fangs in the dark. Something chasing him, not with claws, but with hunger. It whispered in his ear in a language he didn't know but understood. Promises of power. Of clarity. Of freedom from the burden of divine purpose. He turned. And saw himself. Not a man, but a thing, twisted and lupine. His own face split by a snout, yellow eyes burning, sword discarded for claws. I can make you clean, the thing said. All you have to do is let go. He woke with a gasp. Something was watching. Myra was still asleep. But outside, he saw movement. Figures. 5. No, 6. Stalking through the trees on silent feet. Not beastmen. Not like the ones before. These were human. Hunters. Real ones. Each wore hide armor and bone necklaces, skin painted with blood and ash. One had a bow slung over his shoulder, another carried a machete nearly as long as Gideon's sword. Their eyes were hollow. Empty of mercy. And they were following the same blood trail Gideon had followed. Myra's trail. He gripped judgment. The blade pulsed in his hand, eager. He stepped into the open. They stopped when they saw him. Not fear. Surprise. Then the leader stepped forward. A man with an eye patch made of tanned skin. "You're in the trial, Paladin?" he asked. Gideon said nothing. "You've no mark. Not prey. So why follow the blood? She's a child." The man laughed. "She's the game. I'll not let you touch her." The laughter died. "You're in Valachan, dog. You think your god walks here? You think she, Chakuna, lets the trial be interrupted?" Gideon pointed his blade at the hunter's chest. "She doesn't have to let me do anything." The man sighed. "I really didn't want to kill you." Then he whistled. The arrow hit Gideon in the side. He grunted, armor turned most of it, but the point pierced the mail and bit into his ribs. He ripped it free, blood leaking from the wound. Another arrow came, this one deflected by his shield. The hunters advanced. Gideon charged. He cut through the first with a backhand slash, judgment searing through shoulder and spine. The hunter collapsed in 2 pieces. The second came in with a spear. He caught it with his shield, twisted, and drove his gauntlet into the man's face, cracking bone. A follow-up swing of his sword opened the man's chest. The others circled him. Machetes, knives, fangs carved from obsidian. He was bleeding. Slower. The third hunter darted forward, slashing his thigh. Pain. The fourth slammed a club into his back. He went to one knee. And then Myra was there. She stabbed the archer in the leg. The man howled and turned, too late. Gideon rose and rammed his sword into the hunter's gut. Pulled it free in a spray of blood. Now only 2 remained. "Run," he shouted at Myra. She didn't. The last 2 hunters hesitated. Looked at each other. Then turned and vanished into the jungle, slipping between the trees like smoke. Cowards. Or smart? Gideon dropped to one knee, clutching his side. Blood soaked his mail. Myra ran to him, pale. "You're bleeding." "I've bled before. You saved me." He looked up at her. "You're still a child. I'm a killer now." Silence. Then Gideon stood, grimacing. "You'll need to be." Chapter 3, Whispers of the Beast. Word count, Chapter 3 2112. Total word count, 5563. Gideon pressed a hand to the wound in his side. Hot blood slicked his fingers. The pain pulsed like a war drum beneath his skin, echoing through muscle and bone. Myra knelt beside him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but determination. "You're hurt," she said. "I've been worse. You're bleeding to death. Still worse." She ignored him. Ripped a strip from her already ruined tunic and pressed it hard against the wound. Gideon hissed between clenched teeth but didn't stop her. "Hold it there," she said. "Unless you want your insides to become your outsides." He obeyed. "You've done this before," he grunted. She tied it off with a knot that made his vision blur. "My father was a tanner. You learn fast, or the knives get you." He tried to laugh. It came out as a wet cough. They stayed in the hollow tree for the rest of the night. Myra kept watch, clutching the hunter's bow she'd stolen. She didn't know how to use it properly, but it made her feel stronger. Gideon drifted between sleep and pain-drenched lucidity, haunted by broken dreams. In one, he saw his old comrades, Knights of the Dawn Covenant, lying in a shattered chapel. Their armor scorched. Their faces missing. In another, he stood before the gates of a golden city, but the gates slammed shut in his face, the light turning black. And through it all, the whisper remained. You don't belong to them anymore. Dawn, if it could be called that in Valachan, came with thick fog and heavy silence. Gideon forced himself upright, gritting his teeth. Myra looked at him, skeptical. You're going to rip that open? Then I'll bleed on everything that follows. She offered him a strip of dried meat. He chewed slowly, each bite tasting like ash and iron. Then they moved. Their goal was unclear. There were no roads in Valachan, only paths carved by prey, or by the hunting packs that stalked them. But Gideon had one instinct. Chacuna must be found. End her, and the trial ends. Or perhaps it wouldn't. Perhaps the realm would simply create another predator, another set of rules. But it didn't matter. Justice is not about winning. It is about what is right. Even here. Even in hell. They came upon a village at dusk. A ruin, really. Hidden in the roots of a massive tree, with only a few walls and broken huts remaining. No roofs. No doors. But there were signs of recent habitation, ashes in a fire pit, footprints in the dirt. And blood. Not animal. Human. Gideon motioned for Myra to stay back. He stepped into the ruins with judgment drawn. The sword hummed lowly, sensing corruption nearby. He scanned the shadows, heart thudding with a steady beat. A cough. Gurgling. Wet. Then a voice, help, please. A man. Slumped in one of the ruined huts. He was a wreck, one leg gone below the knee, tied off with a strip of fabric, his skin pale and slick with sweat. Bite marks covered his arms. You're not one of them, the man rasped. No. Then, end me. Gideon stepped forward. What happened? The beasts, the children of Chacuna. They come at night. Not always to kill. Sometimes just to play. Sometimes to take. Were you part of the trial? The man nodded weakly. They gave me the claw. 3 days ago. Said I had 7 before the wild hunt came. But I didn't last a day. The others were stronger. I ran. He coughed. Blood flecked his lips. I've been hiding. But they found me last night. Laughed when they bit me. Said I'd die slow. Said she wanted me to see what I'd become. What do you mean? The man's eyes, clouded with fever, focused for a moment. You don't understand, do you? This trial isn't just for fun. It's feeding her. And when we die here, we don't always die. Sometimes. His breath hitched. We come back. Gideon felt his blood turn cold. The man smiled. A mouthful of red. I can feel it. My hands itch. My mouth's dry. I'm getting hungry. He lunged. Gideon's blade flashed. Judgment carved through the man's chest and spine. He collapsed, twitching, then still. Myra stood at the doorway, pale. Was he turning? She asked. Gideon wiped his blade. Yes. She said nothing. Just stared at the body. Then, I want to kill her. Chacuna. Gideon nodded. We will. That night, the howling began. Not wolves. Something larger. Louder. They circled the ruins, pacing the tree line. Myra sat with her back to a stone wall, bow in hand, arrow nocked. Gideon stood watch beside her, his shield resting against his wounded side. "Why do they wait?" Myra whispered. "Because we're being watched." He wasn't guessing. He knew. A presence beyond the trees. Not just beast. Not just hunter. Something regal. Monstrous. Patient. Chacuna. She did not need to attack. Not yet. Fear was part of the sport. At dawn, they moved again. Gideon felt weaker. The wound in his side festered, despite Myra's cleaning. The infection was setting in. He limped now, his shield slung across his back. Myra walked ahead, scouting. They came across a stream. Clean water. Gideon dropped to his knees and drank deeply, feeling some of the pain ease. Myra splashed her face, then froze. Footprints. Gideon looked. And saw them. Bare. Human. Small. Children. Heading upriver. He rose slowly. "We follow." They tracked the footprints for hours. Then, voices. "Hi." Laughing. Gideon moved forward carefully, Myra at his side. They saw them. 3 children. Dirty. Wild-eyed. Playing in a ring of standing stones covered in moss. One held a rabbit. Another had a sharp stone. They were cutting into it, slowly. Carefully. Watching the blood drain out. Gideon stepped forward. The children turned, and hissed. Myra gasped. Their eyes were yellow. Their teeth, sharp. One of them leapt at Gideon. He caught the child midair and slammed it into the ground. It screeched, inhuman. Not a child anymore. Something else. Its limbs twisted, bones popping, skin stretching into fur and claw. A half-shifted beast. The other 2 attacked Myra. She stabbed one through the shoulder, dodged the second. Gideon stood, blade ready. He didn't want to kill them. But these were no longer human. The fight ended in blood. Only one child lay breathing, wounded, broken, sobbing. The beast form receding. Gideon knelt beside her. "Why?" he asked. She looked up at him. No malice. Just sorrow. "She watches," the girl whispered. "From the trees. From the stone. She sees us. We belong to her now." Gideon's heart sank. "What's your name?" "Lena." "Do you want to be free, Lena?" She trembled. "I don't remember what that feels like." Myra knelt beside her and held her hand. They traveled with Lena that night. She couldn't walk far, so Gideon carried her. Myra found wild roots and roasted them over a fire of dry bark. They ate in silence. Lena spoke only once. "She lives in the mountain," she whispered. "The mountain with the dead heart. Where the red moon rises." Gideon's pulse quickened. "A real mountain. She calls it the Red Fang. It sings when it rains. And the stone is warm. Can you take us there?" Lena nodded. "Then that's where we go," Gideon said. They reached the base of the mountain 3 days later. It wasn't natural. The peak loomed like a fang over the jungle, its sides slick with red stone. The wind howled through the ridges, and the air smelled of copper. There were bones at the base. Hundreds. Thousands. Some stripped clean. Some still twitching. Myra gripped Gideon's hand. "This is it," she said. He nodded. They began the ascent. Next chapter incoming. Chapter 4, The Mountain with the Dead Heart. Word count, Chapter 4 2106. Total word count, 7,669. "This is a graveyard," Myra said, her voice hushed. "A killing field." Gideon didn't respond. He stood among the bones, staring up at the jagged peak. The mountain radiated malice. Not merely a place, it hated. Each gust of wind cut like a whispering threat. The stone beneath their feet was warm and veined with dark crimson, like dry blood under stretched skin. Lena clung to Myra's arm. Her eyes had dulled since they'd left the ruins. Her body was small, frail, but the beast still lived beneath her skin. She twitched in her sleep, muttering things that weren't words. "This is it," Gideon said. "She's here." Myra looked up. "You sure?" "I feel her." He did. Like a pressure behind the eyes, pushing inward. The presence that had stalked them for days now pressed down like a god's gaze. The trial was almost over. The way up was no path. Only the bare slope of volcanic stone and jagged ridges like claws reaching out from the mountain's belly. They climbed in silence, Gideon's wounded side burning with each breath. Myra helped where she could, pushing him from behind, catching his arm when he slipped. Lena pointed them upward, toward a cleft in the stone that pulsed with faint red light. "She waits," the girl whispered. "In the dead heart." The cleft became a tunnel. They stepped into it without hesitation. Inside, the walls bled light. A faint, dull crimson that throbbed in time with something deeper, something alive beneath the rock. The air was moist and stank of rot. Animal pelts, stitched together from multiple hides, hung like curtains along the walls. Bones, clean and white, lined the floor in decorative spirals. Symbols were carved into the walls. Not written language. Marks. Deep claw scores, talons dragged through flesh like stone. "She marks her kills," Gideon murmured. "No," said Myra. "Her territory." They passed through a chamber filled with skulls. Human. Beast. Some twisted hybrids. Myra stopped at one, an armored helm cracked down the center, a familiar crest still etched into the brow. She looked at Gideon. "This was one of yours." He nodded once. Then they heard it. A low growl. Not from an animal. From something with a voice. Deep and feminine and full of hunger. "You've come far, Paladin." They turned toward the sound, but saw nothing. Only flickering light. And shadows that moved. "She speaks," Myra whispered. "Chakuna," Gideon called out. "Show yourself." Another growl. "You trespass on blood-soaked ground. You bear the claw. You accept the hunt. Now, the final rule." The walls trembled. One must fall. She descended from the shadows. 7 feet tall, her body lean and muscled like a great cat. Fur and sinew, claw and fang. But her eyes were human, and far worse than the rest. They shimmered with cruel intelligence. "Paladin of the bright flame," she said. "Do you still believe in justice?" Gideon stepped forward, sword in hand. "I believe in what's right." She bared her teeth. "Then you are a fool." She dropped from the ledge above them, landing in silence. No sound. No impact. as though the mountain welcomed her. The battle began before anyone moved. Gideon lunged. Judgment sang, its golden edge catching the red light. Chacuna dodged, barely. Her claws swept out, raking across his shield, sending him reeling. Myra fired. The arrow struck her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned and smiled. You bring prey to fight your battles. She darted toward Myra with unnatural speed. Gideon moved to intercept, but pain lanced his side. Too slow. Chacuna reached Myra and slammed her into the wall. Bone cracked. Myra screamed. Gideon roared. Flames burst from the sword's hilt, engulfing it in blinding light. He charged, blade first. Chacuna turned, and caught the blade between her claws. Her hand burned. She howled. But didn't let go. They grappled, light against darkness. Chacuna's claws carved furrows in Gideon's armor. His blade cut into her thigh, sending sparks of blood into the air. She laughed, even as she bled. You fight like one who's already dead. Gideon slammed his forehead into hers. Bone cracked. She stumbled. He pressed the attack, shield raised, sword ready. He slashed her belly, deep. She retaliated with a kick that hurled him across the chamber. He struck the ground and didn't move. Blood poured from his side. Myra crawled toward her bow, breath rattling. Chacuna turned to her, limping. You're no hero. No hunter. Just a girl. I survived, Myra spat, longer than your toys. Chacuna raised a claw. Lena screamed. The child had stood, barefoot on blood-slick stone. Don't hurt her. Lena shrieked. Don't kill them. Don't. Her body twisted. Bones cracked. Her hands grew claws. Fur spread across her neck and chest. Her jaw elongated, her eyes turning gold. She was turning. No, Myra began. But Lena didn't attack. She stood between Myra and Chacuna, trembling. Please, she whispered, stop hurting them. Chacuna tilted her head. Still clinging to your scraps of humanity, she sneered. You are mine. You were reborn in blood. No, Lena said. Tears ran down her furred cheeks. I choose them. Gideon stood. Burning. His body failing. His soul screaming. But the oath still lived. Light exploded from his chest, bathing the chamber in radiance. He raised judgment, its blade now pure fire. For every life stolen. He stepped forward. For every soul twisted. Another step. For every child broken. He ran. I condemn you. Chacuna turned too late. The blade struck home. Through her ribs. Through her heart. The light burned her from the inside. She screamed, no longer a beast, no longer a hunter, but something older. Something primal. Her body tore apart in a storm of white fire and shadow. Her voice became a shriek that echoed into the mountain's bones. Then silence. The chamber cracked. The walls shuddered. The red light dimmed. Lena collapsed. Myra caught her. Gideon dropped to one knee. She's gone, he said. No, Myra replied. They looked up. The ceiling had opened. Above them, sky. For the first time in Valachan, they saw the stars. Later, in the ruins below the mountain, they sat around a small fire. Myra's ribs were broken. Gideon could barely breathe. Lena lay wrapped in Myra's cloak, half human again, her form twitching between shapes as the infection slowly receded. "She's free of it," Myra said. "I think." Gideon nodded. The claw-shaped mark on his shoulder had vanished. The trial was over. Or perhaps, just paused. He stared into the fire, thinking of all those who hadn't survived. Of those who might come next. Valachan would endure. But so would he. Chapter V, Echoes of the Howling Winds. Word count, Chapter V 2092. Total word count, 9,761. The fire cracked and hissed as the cold night air swirled around them. Gideon stood at the edge of the cliff, his armor now a tarnished mockery of its former glory. His chest still burned, each breath a ragged rasp, but the light inside him was not gone. It was merely dimming. Myra sat by the fire, watching over Lena, who was now fully in the form of a girl once again, but pale and trembling. Her transformation had been slower than Gideon had hoped, her body still struggling against the hunger of the beast inside. But there was no denying it, she was free of Chakuna's corruption. Yet the question lingered in the silence between them. What now? The mountains had fallen still. The once echoing howls of wolves and creatures of nightmare had quieted, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The air was too still. The stars above had a distant, cold look to them, as though even the heavens themselves were watching, waiting. "You should rest," Myra said softly. "You've fought enough." "I don't know if I can," Gideon replied, his voice low. "It's like a weight has settled on me, on all of us. As though the land itself is still bleeding from what we did." Myra's gaze softened, though there was something hardened behind her eyes. She looked at Lena, who had curled up near the fire, her eyes open but unfocused, gazing at the stars as if seeing something beyond them. "None of us will ever be the same after this," she said. "And none of us will be free of this place. Valachan, it eats at you. Slowly. Steady. Until you don't even know what's left of you." Gideon clenched his jaw, looking away toward the twisted, blood-tinged horizon. "I thought I was free of the curse. But it follows. It always follows. The light, the oath, it's not enough." Myra stood, her fingers tracing the edge of her blade. "It's the price of doing what we do. The land remembers, and the land has teeth. Teeth that bite hard," Gideon muttered, his eyes flickering toward the distant, unseen edges of the cursed mountains. "How do we leave this place? How do we escape its grip?" "We don't." Myra's voice was cold, but not without compassion. "We endure. We fight. We survive, until we break." They had barely slept when the storm arrived. The wind howled down the cliffs with the ferocity of a beast awakened. It tore through their camp like a living thing, whipping the fire to nothing, sending ash into their eyes and mouths. The stars vanished behind thick clouds that rolled in, dark as pitch. The temperature plummeted as though the very bones of the earth had turned to ice. Lena whimpered from where she lay near the embers, her body shivering despite the warmth of the fire. "Something's coming," Myra whispered, her hand tightening around her blade. Her eyes darted toward the mountains, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, like fingers reaching down from the heavens themselves. "Stay close," Gideon said, his voice a rasp. His hand reached for his sword as his other gripped the pendant of his oath. They had not made it far from the mountain's base when the shape appeared. It was not a man. Not a beast. Not a creature at all. It was a thing of wind, of shadow, of teeth and claws and hunger. Its body was insubstantial, made of the swirling storm itself. But within that storm, there was a silhouette. A figure cloaked in shadow, tall, skeletal, and dripping with the stink of decay. The thing spoke, not with words, but with a voice of jagged ice and snapping bone. "You think you survived?" Myra didn't hesitate. Her bow was in her hand, an arrow already notched. She fired without a word. The arrow whistled through the air, but it passed right through the creature, vanishing into the darkness beyond. "Nothing survives, Valachan," it continued, its voice colder now. "Not the living. Not the dead." Gideon stood, his legs trembling, his sword in hand. "You're wrong," he spat. "I've survived things worse than you." The storm thing, this monstrosity born of wind and bone, laughed. It wasn't a sound. It was a scream that carried through the wind, through his mind, through the deepest parts of his soul. "You are nothing but another lost soul, Paladin. And like all who have come before you, you will break." The storm surged forward, snapping its claws. In the blink of an eye, it was upon them. Its reach extended like a flood, its very presence filling their lungs with ice-cold despair. Myra gasped as she was caught in the wind. The arrow in her hand shattered under its force. She was thrown back, her body slamming against a jagged stone. Lena screamed, trembling as the beast moved past her, its unnatural cold seeping into her bones. "No!" Gideon shouted. He stepped forward, his sword raised high. He charged, and met the storm head-on. The blade hit. Not flesh. Not bone. But something else. Something insubstantial, yet solid all the same. The blade of judgment passed through the creature's form, the light of the oath flaring briefly before it was swallowed whole by the storm. And yet, something changed. The creature hissed, shrieking in agony. Its form flickered, for the briefest moment, like a candle flame about to extinguish. Gideon didn't hesitate. He pressed forward. Light burned from him, the flames of his oath alight with fury. His vision narrowed, his focus absolute. The creature howled as it fought to recede into the darkness. But Gideon wouldn't let it. He wouldn't let this cursed land take them any further. With a roar, he cleaved into the storm itself, shattering the darkness, driving the light into the heart of the thing. The storm shattered. Gideon collapsed, blood dripping from his brow. His sword lay beside him, its glow fading as the last embers of the creature's presence were snuffed out. The winds died. The temperature slowly began to rise again. Myra was on her feet, kneeling beside him. "That was too close," she muttered, but her voice was tinged with something darker. Something older. She glanced at the horizon, where the storm had once been. And in the distance, the mountains now seemed more alive than ever. "We've only made it worse," she whispered. "Whatever that thing was, it's part of something greater. Then we fight it. We don't stop." Gideon's voice was a growl, though it was weakened. "We never stop." They had no choice but to press on. The darkness had noticed them. Chapter 6, A Stain Upon the Soul. Word count, Chapter 6 2121. Total word count, 11,882. The days bled into one another. Time in Valachan was a cruel, endless cycle, dawn offered no solace, and the night brought no relief. Every morning brought a sense of dread, every evening a gnawing emptiness. But there was no turning back. Gideon had learned that much. The air grew colder as they traveled further into the mountain range. They had passed beyond the regions once known to the locals as the heart of the howling winds, but what lay ahead was not much better. The lands of Valachan were warped and sickened by the very forces that ruled here. The land seemed to hunger, waiting for something, someone to slip up, to make one fatal mistake. It was on the 4th day after the storm creature had been destroyed that they found the village. The village stood at the base of a towering cliff, its small cottages perched precariously on the edge, as though the land itself threatened to devour it. The stone walls of the homes were blackened and cracked, the roofs missing tiles, the windows dark and empty. Gideon's instincts screamed at him, but there was no time for caution. They had to push forward. Myra was the first to enter the village. She moved with the grace of a shadow, her eyes scanning every corner as if expecting the dead to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. "Stay alert," she warned, her voice a low whisper. "This place reeks of death." Lena, though silent, stayed close to Gideon, her face pale, her eyes haunted by the memories of the beast she had fought to escape. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of snow underfoot. They passed dilapidated homes, their doors cracked open like the jaws of a long-dead beast, staring at them with vacant, soulless eyes. "Something's wrong," Gideon muttered, his voice laced with unease. The village should have been abandoned, but there was an unmistakable presence here. "No," Myra replied, halting in her tracks. She looked to the side, where a figure stood just at the edge of the shadows, barely visible. A pale face, hollowed eyes. The figure's mouth was ajar as if whispering something just beyond hearing. "Myra," Gideon said, his voice heavy with the weight of a terrible recognition. "They are here," she whispered back, her face grim. They approached cautiously, every step measured, as the figure finally moved from the shadows. Its face was gaunt, skin drawn tight over bones like old parchment. The eyes were wide, staring with the hollow gaze of someone long lost to the horrors of Valachan. The figure's hands trembled as it reached forward, then stopped, looking up at Gideon. The words that came from its mouth were soft, broken, barely audible. "Please, save us." The woman, no, the creature, before them was barely human. She was nothing more than a shell, held together by some cruel force. She swayed on her feet, her breath ragged and shallow, her mouth working like she was chewing on words that did not belong to her. "Who are you?" Gideon asked, though he already knew the answer. I was once a mother," she replied, her voice cracking like ice. "But now, I am nothing, just a thing." Her eyes flicked to the side as though hearing something that none of them could. She stepped back slowly, her gaze darting nervously. "I did not choose this. None of us did." Her hands trembled, her knuckles white. "It came, like a shadow, like a storm, ripping at us. And we could not escape." Gideon's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. His heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the curse of Valachan pressing in on him. "Escape from what?" Myra asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "What's happening here?" The woman hesitated. Her gaze flicked nervously behind them, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "The wind, it calls to us. It whispers, it takes us." At that moment, the ground beneath their feet trembled with a force that rattled the very air. A deep, guttural roar echoed through the village as if the earth itself was waking from a long, torturous sleep. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, hunched, cloaked in shadows so deep that even the light of the dying day could not penetrate it. It moved with unnatural speed, its arms stretched like claws, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light. Its mouth was full of jagged, broken teeth, and it hissed as it approached them. The wind howled once more, but now it carried with it the stench of rot. The air itself felt heavy, as if something malevolent had just entered their midst. The creature's voice was a gravelly whisper that sent shivers down Gideon's spine. "You should not have come here," the woman screamed, throwing herself back as the creature advanced. Gideon was already moving. His sword was in his hand, and with a single, practiced motion, he swung it in an arc toward the creature. The blade met its shadowy form, but it passed through it as though it was made of smoke, leaving nothing but the sound of a piercing, mocking laugh behind. Myra was already retreating, pulling Lena back toward the center of the village, her bow ready. The creature took another step forward, its form rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. "You cannot defeat what is not alive," it hissed. Gideon's heart raced. He had to do something to stop this nightmare from continuing. With a prayer to the light, he took a step forward, his sword raised high. "I may not defeat you, creature," he growled, his voice filled with both rage and desperation. "But I will banish you." The sword crackled with divine power, its light flaring up as he brought it down upon the creature's form. This time, it screamed. The sound was a horrid mix of agony and rage, a cacophony of voices not of this world. The creature twisted in the air, contorting as though the light of Gideon's strike was burning through it. But then, nothing. It vanished. Gideon stood there, breathing heavily, the sword still glowing faintly in his hand. He could feel the tension in the air slowly dissolve, but a new chill had replaced the old one. The village had fallen silent again, but not in the way it had been before. This silence was worse, unnatural, like the land itself held its breath. The woman had vanished, as well. Gideon turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "It's not over," he said, his voice hoarse. "We've only just begun." Chapter 7, A Moment's Hesitation. Word count, Chapter 7 2108. Total word count, 13,990. The silence was maddening. Gideon's every step on the snow-crusted ground seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the earth itself were listening. He stood at the center of the village, his eyes scanning the shadows that stretched like long fingers over the abandoned homes. The wind no longer howled. There was no more rustling of trees or the usual creaks of old buildings. There was only the oppressive quiet. Myra's face was grim, her bow lowered slightly but still ready. She scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowed as though she were seeing something none of them could. "Did you feel that?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Gideon nodded, though he didn't know if he could explain it. The air itself felt wrong. The sense of pressure had returned, stronger than ever, like a looming storm just beyond the horizon, one that would tear the world asunder. "Yes," he muttered, "the land is alive here. And not in a good way." Lena stood behind them, her eyes wide with fear, her body trembling, though she tried her best to keep her composure. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, as though expecting the wind itself to reach out and claim her. "You think that thing will come back?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He wanted to reassure her, but there was no comfort to offer. They were in a place where hope itself had no power. All they had was the sword in his hand, and that felt more like a fragile promise than a guarantee of safety. "I think this village is a trap," Myra muttered. "A baited snare. And we're walking straight into it." Gideon clenched his fists around the hilt of his sword. He had no doubt that Myra was right. The creature, whatever it had been, wasn't just some random threat. It was something far worse. It was a sentinel, an agent of the darkness that ruled this place,
In the grim
and they had
darkness of
angered it. They needed answers. They needed to find out who or what had turned this village into a haunted shell of its former self. The group continued moving forward, their steps quick and deliberate. The village was a maze of crumbling buildings, dead streets, and fallen trees. The once familiar paths were twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. It was clear now that whatever had happened here, it wasn't just a monster attack or a natural disaster. The land itself had been warped, twisted by forces older and more dangerous than any of them could imagine. At the edge of the village, they found the remnants of a temple. The stone pillars had long since fallen, the walls cracked and weathered by time, but the faint markings of an ancient ritual still clung to the ruins. This must have been where it began, Gideon muttered, running his fingers across the worn carvings. Myra stepped closer, studying the symbols with narrowed eyes. This isn't just any temple. These markings. She paused. They're not of Valachan. What do you mean? Lena asked, still keeping her distance from the ruins. The language. These runes are older, much older. They come from a place beyond the mists, Myra said, her voice heavy with concern. What are you saying? Gideon pressed, a chill creeping up his spine. I'm saying that whoever, or whatever, did this, didn't come from Valachan, Myra replied. And that means we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we've encountered. Gideon stood in the heart of the ruined temple, his mind racing. The idea that an external force had made its mark on this land unsettled him deeply. Valachan was a cursed place, yes, but the idea of something foreign wielding such power was terrifying. The pieces were slowly falling into place, though they didn't fit neatly together. He could feel the weight of it all pressing on him, the burden of knowing that the deeper they ventured into this accursed land, the less likely they were to return unscathed. He reached down, tracing his fingers along the markings once more. The symbols pulsed with an unnatural energy, their presence like a thorn in his side. The wind howled through the temple, shaking loose a chunk of stone from the ceiling. The ground trembled. And then, it appeared. A figure stepped from the shadows, its form cloaked in shadow and obscurity, its face hidden behind a mask of black metal. The air itself seemed to recoil from it, as if the very elements were unwilling to acknowledge its existence. Gideon's hand tightened around his sword, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew this figure. He had seen it before, in the dreams that plagued him during the long nights on the road. But this was real. I've been waiting for you, Paladin, the figure's voice echoed, its tone cold, unfeeling. I was wondering when you would arrive. Gideon's jaw clenched. Who are you? He demanded, stepping forward, his sword gleaming in the dim light. What do you want? The figure tilted its head, as though amused by Gideon's question. I am the one who watches, it said simply. I am the one who waits. Gideon's eyes narrowed, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. What is this place? What have you done to these people? The figure's laughter was soft, almost melodic. It is not I who have done anything, Paladin. I am but the messenger. The harbinger of the inevitable. Answer me. Gideon snarled, his patience thinning. Who are you? What do you want with us? The figure's form seemed to flicker for a moment, like a shadow playing in the corner of his vision. And then, as if in response to his frustration, it spoke again. You are here because you must be here, it said, its voice reverberating through Gideon's very bones. It is fate. The wind has brought you. The figure took a step closer, its presence like a dark cloud suffocating the light around them. But you will not leave, Paladin, it continued. Not unless you embrace the darkness. Unless you yield to the curse that has taken hold of this land. Gideon took a step back, his breath shallow. The figure's words were chilling, more so than any physical threat could ever be. To yield to the darkness. To embrace the curse. No, Gideon whispered, his resolve hardening. I will never yield. The figure's masked face seemed to contort into a grin. Very well, Paladin. But know this, it will come for you. And when it does, there will be no turning back. With that, the figure turned, melting back into the shadows from which it had come. Gideon stood in stunned silence, the weight of its words pressing down on him like a crushing stone. Myra stepped forward, her hand resting on his shoulder. We need to keep moving. Gideon nodded, though his heart was heavy. He could feel it now, the thing that had been lurking at the edges of his mind. The curse. There was no escaping it. No defeating it. Not unless he paid the price. Chapter 8, The Weight of Fate. Word count, Chapter 8 2092. Total word count, 16,082. The village had grown darker, more oppressive, as though the very land itself was watching them. The temple loomed in the distance like an ever-present spectre, and the unsettling quiet that had descended upon the settlement seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve remained unshaken. The shadowy figure had left them with nothing but cryptic words, but there was something about its voice, its presence, that gnawed at him. It had spoken as though it knew something about him, something about his past, about his purpose here in Valachan. The curse it spoke of seemed to echo in his mind, threatening to swallow his thoughts whole. He glanced at Myra, who was still studying the ruins of the temple with a distant look in her eyes, as if trying to decipher something only she could see. Her usual confidence was tempered with caution, and Gideon could see the lines of worry etched into her face. We need to get out of here, she said, breaking the silence. This place, it's not just abandoned. There's something here, something we haven't seen yet. Something waiting for us. Gideon nodded. He could feel it too. The pressure. The sense of being hunted. They couldn't stay much longer. But as they turned to leave, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The wind kicked up, howling through the broken buildings like a mournful wail. A scream echoed through the village, a woman's scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. Get down! Gideon shouted, pushing Myra and Lena to the ground as he drew his sword. The scream was followed by another, this time a man's voice, then more voices, rising in chorus, calling out in terror and desperation. The ground beneath them seemed to shake as if some great force was stirring beneath the earth. Stay close! Gideon ordered, his heart pounding as he scanned the village for any signs of movement. We need to find shelter, now. But as he turned, his eyes were drawn to a figure standing at the far end of the village square, silhouetted by the eerie light of the moon. It was tall, almost too tall, its body cloaked in darkness. Its face was hidden, but the faint outline of its figure seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, radiating malice. The figure raised one arm, and the ground cracked open in front of it, a deep chasm splitting the earth. The very air seemed to twist, as if the fabric of reality itself was being stretched and torn. By the gods! Gideon muttered under his breath. The creature that had appeared before them, the one they had felt watching them, was no longer a mere shadow. It was here, in the flesh, and it was bringing the land to its knees. "Run!" Myra shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Gideon wasted no time. He grabbed Lena by the arm and pulled her with him, moving toward the nearest building. Behind them, the screams of the villagers grew louder, more frantic. He could hear the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing to the ground, followed by the unmistakable roar of something hungry, something primal. Myra was already ahead of them, her bow drawn and ready, her eyes scanning for any signs of danger. But even she couldn't mask the fear in her eyes as she turned to face the growing darkness behind them. The creature's laughter filled the air. It was a sound that rattled the bones and tore at the soul, a sound that carried with it the weight of death itself. "No!" Gideon shouted, turning to face the creature. His heart thudded in his chest, his sword raised in defiance. "You will not take them." But the creature's response was a mere whisper, a cold, mocking tone that slid into his ears like ice. "You are already too late," it said. "You are all already mine." With a sudden, terrifying motion, the creature extended its hand toward them. The air around it shimmered, and in an instant, a bolt of dark energy shot toward Gideon. He barely had time to raise his shield before the bolt struck him with a force that sent him staggering back, his breath knocked out of him. The shield held, but the force of the impact was nearly enough to send him sprawling. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He needed to act fast. "Gideon, we can't stop it," Myra shouted, her voice filled with panic as she loosed a volley of arrows at the creature. But the arrows struck the thing and simply dissolved into mist, as if they had never been. The creature's form shifted, twisting in the air, as if it were a mere shadow given flesh. It moved with terrifying speed, closing the distance between them with a single step. "Die!" it hissed, and the earth beneath Gideon's feet buckled again, sending him sprawling onto his knees. Gideon rose, his hands trembling as he raised his sword once more, the hilt slick with sweat. The creature was so close now, its dark presence suffocating him, pushing him to the edge of madness. His heart raced, but he couldn't afford to falter. "Not now. I will not yield to you," he spat, his voice hoarse but firm. His sword shone with a faint light as he summoned every ounce of his divine power, channeling it into the blade. His prayers were whispers, quiet but urgent, the words of his oath rising from the depths of his soul. The creature's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, flared with malice. It leaned down, its twisted face mere inches from his own. "I told you, Paladin," it murmured, its breath foul and cold. "You are already mine." Gideon's heart skipped a beat as the creature reached for him, its hand like a clawed vice. But before it could make contact, there was a sudden flash of light, blinding, pure, and merciless. The creature recoiled, its form shuddering. Gideon's shield flared with divine energy, its light filling the entire village square. The ground beneath them cracked open, and for a brief moment, the creature was forced back, its form distorted by the divine light. "No!" it screamed, its voice breaking the air like a glass shard through bone. It stumbled backward, writhing in agony. Gideon didn't wait. He lunged forward, his sword raised high, and in a single, powerful stroke, he drove it deep into the creature's heart. For a moment, everything stood still. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a sickening crack, the creature's form shattered, its body dissolving into shadows, its blood black and viscous as it pooled around Gideon's feet. Myra and Lena rushed to his side, both of them looking at him with a mixture of awe and terror. The battle was over, at least for now, but the air was still heavy, the village still cursed. You did it, Myra whispered, her voice hoarse. Gideon's sword dropped from his hand, the weight of the battle finally settling on his shoulders. But his victory was hollow. The creature was gone, but the darkness had only grown stronger. They had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. We must go, Gideon said, his voice low. This place is far from over. Chapter 9, Into the Abyss. Word count, Chapter 9 2137. Total word count, 18,219. The village had fallen eerily silent after the creature's defeat, but the oppressive weight in the air had not lifted. Gideon stood in the center of the village square, his chest heaving, his grip still tight on the hilt of his sword. The blade pulsed faintly with the remnants of divine energy, but it was no longer the shining beacon it had once been. Now, it felt hollow. The power had drained from it as swiftly as it had been summoned, leaving nothing but weariness in its wake. Myra stood beside him, her bow lowered but her eyes darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to cling to every corner of the village. Lena was a few paces behind, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her staff like a lifeline. They had all felt the creature's malice, its hunger, but there was something deeper, something darker, that still lingered in the air, a curse that refused to die. We need to leave, Gideon said, his voice rough, his throat dry. The land will not let us rest here. We are not safe. Myra nodded grimly, her lips pressed into a thin line. No argument here. But where do we go? That thing was only the tip of the iceberg. I can feel the land itself twisting, feeding off that thing's power. It won't stop with just that one creature. Gideon glanced around the village. The buildings, once modest, now seemed ancient and decaying, their walls crumbling under the weight of an age-old curse. The village no longer felt like a place of life, but a place where the dead had walked, and still walked, in a sense. We head toward the temple, Gideon said, his voice unwavering. If the creature's presence has been drawn here, then there must be something in that temple, something that can help us understand what is happening. If nothing else, it may offer us a way to escape. Lena shuddered, casting a fearful glance toward the temple in the distance. The moonlight reflected off its cracked stone surface, giving it an unholy, spectral glow. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though something inside was waiting for them. I don't like it, she muttered, her voice trembling. But I trust you, Gideon. We'll follow your lead. Myra, on the other hand, was far less certain. We've already seen what's inside this village. I'm not sure the temple will be any better. It's a place of power, but it's also a place of corruption. We should be careful. I know, Gideon replied, his hand gripping his sword's hilt with newfound determination. But we've already drawn the attention of something much darker than we could have imagined. We need to know what we're up against. The temple may hold answers. As they moved toward the temple, the darkness seemed to grow more oppressive, as though the very land was trying to swallow them whole. Each step they took felt like they were walking deeper into a nightmare. The air grew colder, the wind whispering around them in strange, guttural tones, as if the village itself were alive and watching them. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out to grab them. The path to the temple was treacherous. The ground was uneven, torn open in places by deep cracks, as though something had ripped through the earth itself. The occasional flash of pale light illuminated the surroundings, casting long, unnatural shadows that danced in the corners of their vision. It felt as though the night itself was conspiring against them, pushing them towards something something they were not meant to find. Gideon quickened his pace, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the temple ahead. The faint sounds of the village's creatures, whispers, claws scraping against stone, the soft shuffle of feet, remained just out of reach, like the noise of a nightmare too distant to be fully real but too close to be ignored. When they finally reached the base of the temple's steps, Gideon felt a deep, cold shudder run through his body. The air was thick with malevolence, as if the temple itself had been waiting for them. The stone steps leading up to the temple were worn and slick with moss, each one seeming to shift underfoot, as if alive. The door at the top of the stairs loomed before them, a massive, iron-bound barrier, twisted runes carved into its surface. "Here we are," Gideon said, his voice steady but filled with foreboding. "Whatever we find inside, we face it together." The others nodded in unison, though there was no mistaking the fear in their eyes. They had seen horrors, but nothing like this, nothing that had touched the very fabric of reality itself. With a deep breath, Gideon reached for the door, his hand trembling slightly as he placed his palm against the cold, rusted iron. There was a faint pulse, almost like a heartbeat, beneath the surface of the door, and Gideon hesitated. "I feel it," Myra whispered, her voice low. "The temple, it's alive." Without another word, Gideon pushed the door open. The inside of the temple was vast, stretching beyond what they could see in the dim light. The walls were lined with ancient, fading murals, strange images of battles fought long ago, twisted figures whose eyes seemed to follow their every movement. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, of something long dead, but still lingering in the shadows. The floor was cracked and uneven, and the pillars supporting the ceiling were twisted and gnarled, like the roots of some ancient, cursed tree. The temple was still. Too still. A sudden noise broke the silence, a soft, creaking sound, as if the temple itself were sighing in its sleep. The sound came from the far end of the hall, where an altar stood bathed in an eerie, flickering light. Blood-red candles burned around it, their flames flickering in the absence of wind. Gideon took a step forward, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the darkness. He could feel the presence of something within the temple, something ancient and powerful, just waiting for them to come closer. "Do you feel that?" Lena whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's like the walls are pressing in on us." "I feel it," Gideon muttered, his grip on his sword tightening. "Stay close." As they approached the altar, the air grew colder, and a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly old, echoed through the temple. "You should not have come here, Paladin." The voice seemed to come from all directions, reverberating off the walls, sending a chill through Gideon's bones. His heart skipped a beat. "We did not come here to serve," Gideon called out, his voice steady despite the terror that threatened to rise within him. "We came to end this." The darkness in the temple seemed to deepen, swallowing the light, and suddenly, a figure materialized before them, tall, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that burned like twin infernos. It stepped forward, and the air seemed to crackle with its presence. "You cannot end what has already begun, Paladin," the figure said, its voice dripping with malice. "You are but a cog in the wheel, and the wheel cannot be stopped." Gideon stepped forward, raising his sword high, the light of the blade gleaming against the darkness. "We shall see," he said, his voice like steel. Chapter X, The Heart of Darkness. Word count, Chapter X 2095. Total word count, 20,314. The figure before them, shrouded in shadow, exuded an aura of power that seemed to suffocate the very air. Its presence stretched out like an immense weight, pressing down on the trio. Gideon's hand trembled around the hilt of his sword, though he would not give voice to his doubt. The figure's burning eyes were fixed on him, its features hidden beneath a dark hood, but the sense of ancient malice in its gaze was unmistakable. "I have seen you before," the figure said, its voice echoing, as though it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Your light is a fragile thing, Paladin. Do you not understand? It is not power that saves you. It is only death that awaits." Gideon clenched his jaw, stepping forward. "Then come, Shadow, and claim what you will." The figure raised a hand, and the temple seemed to shudder. The walls groaned as though the very stones themselves were alive and twisted with an unnatural life. Dark tendrils of mist began to writhe from the ground, creeping along the altar and spiraling toward the group. It was as though the temple itself had come alive, hungry for their presence, pulling them into its embrace. Myra stepped forward, her bow at the ready, the light of her arrows flickering in the dim space. "We've come too far to turn back," she said softly, but there was a note of fear in her voice. "If this is what I think it is, we're dealing with something beyond us." Lena's eyes glowed with arcane energy, the runes etched into her staff pulsing faintly with a light that flickered uncertainly. "I can feel it, too," she whispered, her voice quivering. "It's ancient magic. Darker than anything I've encountered. Whatever this being is, it controls this place. It is the heart of the curse." Gideon turned to them, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we have no choice but to face it." Before any of them could react further, the figure moved. It glided across the room with unnatural speed, its shadowy form flowing like liquid darkness. It reached the altar in a heartbeat and placed its hand upon the stone surface. The air grew colder, the very temperature of the room dropping to an unbearable level, as if death itself had entered the chamber. "Your words mean nothing," the figure hissed. "This temple is my domain, and its power will never leave. Not while I still draw breath." The mist swirling around them thickened, and the light of the candles flickered violently. The walls of the temple began to bleed, ichor dripping from the cracks in the stone like dark veins of some ancient creature. "We are bound here," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more commanding. "We are all bound here, Paladin." In a flash, the figure raised its arms, and the shadows in the room twisted into shapes of nightmarish proportions. Spectral hands reached out of the mist, clawing at their bodies, pulling at their very souls. The air was filled with the sound of whispers, voices from the past, from those who had fallen to the same darkness Gideon now faced. The ground beneath them trembled, the walls shaking as though the temple was preparing to collapse. The oppressive presence of the shadow being was suffocating, pressing in on them from every direction. Gideon roared, his voice filled with defiance. "By the light of justice, I shall cleanse this place." He swung his sword in a wide arc, and the blade burst with divine light, cutting through the nearest tendrils of shadow. The light carved a path through the dark mist, but it was only temporary. The darkness closed in once more. The figure let out a cold, hollow laugh. "You still cling to that foolish light. It will not save you. It will only bring you closer to death's embrace." Gideon took another step forward, raising his blade once more, his heart pounding in his chest. "I will destroy you, foul creature. You will not claim this land." The shadow figure's form rippled, and with a snap, the tendrils of darkness shot forward, wrapping themselves around his arms, his legs. Gideon struggled, trying to break free, but the darkness was too strong, pulling him down toward the altar. Myra's voice rang out in desperation. "Gideon! We have to help him." She fired an arrow into the mist, the light of it cutting through the darkness. For a moment, the shadows recoiled, giving her the briefest of openings. Gideon's sword flared to life again, and with a powerful shout, he broke free of the tendril's grasp. He lunged forward, striking at the figure. The blow landed with a flash of light, but the shadowy being merely absorbed the strike, its form rippling like smoke in the wind. "Foolish mortal," it hissed, its eyes glowing brighter, burning with malevolent fury. "You think your light can burn away the darkness, but you do not understand. I am the darkness. And you are nothing but a fleeting ember that will soon be snuffed out." The ground beneath Gideon's feet trembled again, and the very stone of the temple seemed to pull away, opening up in a chasm that yawned wide beneath them. Black smoke poured from the hole, a roiling mass of darkness and despair that threatened to swallow them whole. Gideon gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with unyielding resolve. "I will not yield." With a final, desperate cry, he raised his sword high above his head, calling upon the last vestiges of his strength. The blade flared with divine fire, and he brought it down with all his might upon the figure. The shadow screamed, its form splintering under the force of the blow. But just as it seemed to crumble, the figure reformed, its form shifting and twisting, reforming with even greater malice. And then, from the very depths of the chasm below, something stirred. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the temple, followed by a series of monstrous screeches. More creatures, more nightmares, emerged from the darkness. Their forms were grotesque, twisted versions of the horrors that had already been faced, yet these were stronger, darker, and far more dangerous. Gideon felt a cold dread creep into his heart, but his grip on his sword never wavered. He could feel the weight of his oath pushing him forward, a silent promise to those who had fallen before him, to those who depended on him. His faith was the only weapon left in his arsenal, and he would use it until the very last drop of his strength had been spent. Chapter 11, The Heart's Descent. Word count, Chapter 11 2140. Total word count, 22,454. The ground shook beneath their feet as the monstrous creatures clawed their way from the abyss, their twisted forms dragging themselves up from the pit of darkness below. The screams of the damned echoed through the temple, a cacophony of lost souls, each one a remnant of those who had come before. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a rotting reminder of the curse that had festered here for centuries. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest, but he gripped his sword tightly, its glow flickering like a dying star. The divine light that had once burned so brightly in his hand now seemed feeble in the face of the growing tide of shadows that surrounded them. His armor, though tarnished and battered, still gleamed with faint traces of holy power, but even that seemed insufficient against the overwhelming presence of the darkness. Myra's voice cut through the oppressive silence, sharp and clear. "We need to stop this. Now. Before it consumes everything." Gideon nodded, though doubt gnawed at his resolve. His eyes scanned the room, searching for some way to turn the tide. The temple, once a place of worship, had become a tomb. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the floor, slick with blood and ichor, threatened to swallow them whole. Lena raised her staff, the runes glowing with a dim, uncertain light. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The source of this evil, it's here, within the very heart of the temple. But the magic is unlike anything I've ever encountered. It's beyond my understanding." Gideon gritted his teeth. "Then we have no choice but to face it head on. We must destroy whatever this is. If we don't, Valachan will be lost." With a grim determination, he stepped forward, his sword held high. The blade shone with a brilliance that seemed to defy the darkness, but even as it lit the path ahead, the shadows clung to him, whispering words of despair in the back of his mind. The shadowy figure that had led them into this hellish nightmare appeared once more, its form towering above them. It seemed to swell, growing larger with every passing moment, until it was nothing less than an embodiment of pure darkness. Its eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and its voice reverberated through the very bones of the temple. "You cannot stop what is inevitable," it intoned, its voice a sibilant hiss. "You are already dead. You just don't know it yet." Gideon's grip tightened on his sword, but the words of the shadow figure struck deeper than he cared to admit. There was truth in its words. He had already lost so much. The people he had sworn to protect, his comrades who had fallen by his side, all of it felt like an impossible weight, a crushing burden he could not cast off. The figure raised its hand, and the temple seemed to respond, shuddering violently. The walls cracked and groaned, as if the very foundation of the building was being ripped apart. The darkness surged, an oppressive force that pressed in from all sides, suffocating them with its power. Myra fired another arrow into the dark, the light from her shot briefly illuminating the room before it was swallowed by the abyss. The arrow struck the shadow figure's form, but it did no more than dissipate into mist. The darkness laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to fill every corner of the temple. "You think your light can save you," the figure mocked. "There is no salvation here. Only death." Gideon's breath came in sharp gasps. The shadows were closing in, the creatures moving ever closer, and yet, despite the overwhelming odds, he stood firm. His heart burned with a fire he could not extinguish. "I have not come to save myself," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. "I have come to end you." The shadow figure's eyes narrowed, and the very air seemed to thicken with tension. A wave of dark energy exploded from the figure's outstretched hand, a torrent of pure malevolence that surged toward Gideon. The force of the attack knocked him back, sending him crashing to the ground, his sword skittering from his hand. The world spun as he struggled to rise. His limbs felt heavy, his body bruised and battered from the assault. He had to get up. He had to fight. He forced himself to his knees, blood trickling down his face from a gash on his brow. The light of his sword flickered weakly beside him, almost as if it, too, were struggling to stay alive. Behind him, he heard the faintest of whispers, Myra and Lena, fighting their own battles against the creatures that were pouring from the chasm. He could hear the sound of arrows striking flesh, the crackle of magical energy as Lena conjured bolts of arcane power, but it was all a distant hum, drowned out by the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. The shadow figure loomed before him, its form shifting and changing, constantly in flux. It was a nightmare made flesh, its presence an affront to everything Gideon had ever believed in. The figure reached out with long, clawed fingers, and Gideon could feel the cold touch of death wrap around his throat. "You cannot defeat me," the figure rasped. "You are but a mortal. A fleeting thing. And I am eternal." Gideon's heart pounded in his chest, but somewhere deep within him, a spark of defiance flared. The words of his mentor echoed in his mind, a memory from long ago. A paladin's strength comes not from the sword or the armor, but from the unyielding light within. With a roar, Gideon shoved the darkness away, pushing himself to his feet. He reached out and seized his sword, the divine light blazing bright once more. It was weak, yes. Fading, perhaps. But it was not gone. He would not allow it to fade. The shadow figure let out a low growl, its eyes glowing brighter, more intense. Gideon raised his sword high, his voice ringing out, "By the light of justice, I will not fall." With one final, desperate strike, he lunged forward, the divine energy within him flaring like a sun that would not be dimmed. The sword, once flickering, now blazed with a brilliance that pushed back the darkness itself. Chapter 12, The Final Choice. Word count, Chapter 12 2135. Total word count, 24,589. The sword in Gideon's grasp hummed with divine power, its light pushing back the suffocating shadow. The moment his blade met the darkness, it shattered like glass, and for a brief moment, the oppressive weight that had surrounded them lifted. The figure recoiled, the air crackling with raw power, but the shadow itself was far from defeated. It roared in fury, its form shifting, swelling, expanding into a mass of writhing tendrils of darkness. It no longer resembled a man but something far more sinister, an ancient, formless evil that sought to consume everything in its path. "Foolish mortal," it snarled, its voice a chorus of 1,000 whispers. "You cannot banish me with mere light. I have been here longer than your kind can fathom. I have devoured worlds. You are but a fleeting spark that will be snuffed out." Gideon's heart thundered in his chest. Sweat poured down his brow, mixing with the blood that trickled from the gash on his forehead. His body ached, every movement a struggle, but his grip on the sword never faltered. The light still burned within, weak but steady. Behind him, the sounds of battle persisted. The shrieks of the abominations that swarmed the temple, the crack of arrows, the hum of Lena's arcane blasts, and Myra's war cries filled the air. But all of it felt distant now, like the echo of something far away. His vision blurred for a moment, dizziness overtaking him. The weight of the battle pressed on him, threatening to crush him beneath its endless tide. The air seemed to grow colder, the light of his sword flickering once more. "I will not be your puppet," Gideon growled through gritted teeth. With a roar of defiance, he swung his sword again, and once more the light flared. The figure screeched, its form contracting in pain, but it was not enough. The darkness recoiled, only to surge forward with greater intensity, tendrils of shadow wrapping around Gideon's arms, pulling him into its embrace. "Your will is nothing," the figure hissed, the cold, suffocating grip tightening. "You think you can resist? You, who have already succumbed." Gideon's vision darkened, and for a brief moment, he felt the pull of despair. The weight of failure, of loss, gripped him like a vice. He had failed to protect those he loved. His allies were dying, their strength faltering. And now, it seemed as though the very light that had once been his guiding force was slipping away. But then, as his strength faltered, he felt a flicker of something deep inside, a pulse of light. Not the divine glow of his sword, but something more personal, something pure, something that had sustained him all these years. His faith. The years of service, the countless battles, the sacrifices he had made, they had not been in vain. His cause was just. His heart, though battered, had never truly been broken. This is not the end. In a final, desperate surge, Gideon broke free of the shadow's grip, his sword raised high, and with a cry that shook the very foundations of the temple, he drove it into the heart of the darkness. There was a moment of silence. Then the temple erupted. Gideon stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, and the very walls seemed to howl as they crumbled. The dark figure writhed, its form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and blood, and the sound of screams filled the cavernous space. But it was not his own scream that he heard, it was the wail of the darkness as it was torn apart. The shadow figure's body twisted, contorted, and finally shattered, collapsing into a cloud of black dust. The once intangible force of evil seemed to collapse in on itself, unraveling, its power dissipating into the void. Gideon, exhausted and blooded, stood amidst the crumbling ruin. His sword, still glowing faintly, was now dim, its divine light nearly extinguished. But it had done its work. The temple that had been the epicenter of so much suffering was now falling apart, the curse that had plagued Valachan for so long beginning to lift. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the ceiling above cracked open. A deafening rumble filled the air as the stone walls began to collapse inward. Gideon's eyes scanned the room, the sight of his companions, battered and bruised, still struggling against the creatures that remained. Myra had an arrow notched, her eyes sharp as she picked off the remaining monstrosities one by one. Lena stood near the entrance, her staff crackling with energy as she held back the last wave of horrors. But it was clear, they couldn't hold much longer. "We have to go," Myra shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Now." Gideon hesitated, looking down at the flickering light of his sword. It felt as though the light itself were fading. He glanced at the crumbling temple around him, then back at his companions. They had come so far, but could they make it out in time? He was no longer sure. The darkness was vanquished, but the temple itself was dying, and the collapse would take everything with it. There was no more time to question. Gideon gave one last, steadying breath, and then, with a final cry, he turned toward the entrance. "For Valachan," he roared, his voice rising above the roar of the collapsing temple. With his sword still glowing faintly in his hand, he ran toward the exit. Myra, Lena, and the others followed, their weapons raised, their steps quickening as the ground shook beneath them. The darkness may have been defeated, but Gideon knew, this was not the end of the battle. The real test was just beginning. Chapter 13, The Last Light. Word count, Chapter 13 2348. Total word count, 26,937. The ground shook violently as Gideon and his companions sprinted through the crumbling temple. The air around them crackled with the residual energy of the dark force that had once dominated the space. The sound of stone grinding against stone, of centuries-old structures being torn asunder, echoed like the death rattle of an ancient beast. Gideon's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning from the exertion, but he kept moving, his sword still clutched tightly in his hand. The light within it was dimming, fading, but it was still there, flickering, stubborn. It had to be enough. "Go!" Myra shouted, her voice strained with urgency, as she released another arrow into the last few creatures that skittered across the broken stone. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was true. "We need to leave before this place collapses completely." "We're not far," Lena called, her voice filled with raw determination, though her face was pale from exhaustion. She held her staff aloft, a beacon of faint arcane energy swirling around her. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt flesh and the remnants of dark magic. "The passage is just ahead." The others pushed forward, and for a moment, Gideon allowed himself to look behind them. The temple was crumbling in earnest now. The walls, once imposing and grand, were now cracking apart. The ceilings were falling in, massive chunks of rock and stone tumbling like a storm of rubble. He could feel the heat of it behind him, the primal force of the collapse, like a beast hunting them. Myra reached the exit first, her bow still ready in her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. She glanced over her shoulder, her face grim. "We're clear. For now." But there was no time to rest. The surrounding landscape of Valachan had once been desolate, marked by dark forests and scarred hills. Now, with the temple's fall, the land felt different, distorted, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn. The wind, once still and oppressive, now howled, carrying the stench of decay and unnaturalness. "We have to keep moving," Gideon said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "Stay close. Stay together." The sky above, once a bruised shade of twilight, had now darkened even further, a roiling mass of clouds that seemed to reflect the turmoil below. The once faint light from Gideon's sword seemed to flicker in time with the storm overhead. A tremor of something darker, a presence, was closing in. It was as though the land itself mourned the passing of the temple, the victory they had fought for. As the group neared the edge of the crumbling ruins, Gideon's vision blurred. His heart raced with every step, and his pulse was an erratic beat in his chest. His sword, it had been the last light, the last hope. But that light had begun to die. "We're too late," he muttered under his breath. Lena looked at him, concern flashing in her eyes. "Gideon, what's wrong? We've made it this far, we just need..." But her voice faltered when she saw the look on his face. He had slowed his pace, his legs giving out beneath him as his body sagged under the weight of fatigue. The light of his sword was barely a flicker now, and Gideon himself seemed hollow, his very presence waning. "No." He staggered, one knee buckling as he fell to the ground, his grip on the sword faltering. The others halted immediately, panic flaring in their expressions. "Myra, Lena. Help him," shouted Valachan, who had been silent until now. His voice broke with fear, but there was nothing they could do. Lena knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his shoulder. "Gideon, stay with us. We're almost out of here. Please, asterisk." But Gideon could not meet her eyes. His gaze was distant, focusing only on the sword in his hand, the dying light within it. It had once been his beacon, his salvation, but now it seemed so weak, so fragile. Just like him. "We won," he whispered, voice hoarse. "We ended it, but it's not enough." Valachan, standing behind them, clenched his fists. "Don't say that. You've done more than anyone could ask of you. The darkness is gone. This land is free." But Gideon could not respond. He could barely hold his head up as the last of his strength drained away, his body failing him after the battle. His sword, the weapon that had seen him through countless trials, slipped from his grasp, and the light within it finally went out. The storm above them raged on, the wind howling like the voices of the lost, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The land around them seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with something primal, something that refused to accept the peace they had fought for. In the silence that followed, something stirred within Gideon, a presence. The faintest flicker of light began to radiate from his chest, from deep within. It was not the light of the sword, nor the light of his paladin's oath. It was something else entirely, a light that had been buried deep within him. His voice was weak, but it still carried the weight of the words he spoke. "I am not done yet." With that, his body shuddered once more, but a wave of energy surged outward. A golden radiance burst from within him, flooding the land, flooding the horizon. The storm above them began to dissipate, the oppressive darkness giving way to the faintest traces of dawn. And in that light, Gideon stood tall once more. The others watched, awestruck, as Gideon rose to his feet, his strength renewed by the sheer force of will. The land had responded to his light, to the final sacrifice he had made, and it had answered. "It is done," he said, voice steady now, though it carried the weight of something much deeper. "The darkness is gone. Valachan is free." But the cost had been dear. Gideon had given everything for this victory, and now he felt the weight of that sacrifice pressing against his chest. His body was broken, but his spirit, that final flicker of light, had been enough to turn the tide. As they stood in the silence that followed the storm, they knew they had lost much. Friends. Allies. Innocents. But they had also won. For all the darkness they had faced, for all the lives lost in this struggle, they had secured a future for Valachan. Gideon could feel the land breathe easier, the weight of 1,000 curses lifting from its shoulders. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he knew that even in the face of victory, the war within himself would never truly end. "The last light may fade," he thought as his strength faltered, "but as long as I draw breath, I will fight. For Valachan. For the people who remain. And for the light that can never be extinguished."